This video isn't a pile of textbook facts, but the real story of his life, filled with struggle, doubt, and great discoveries. You'll learn how Michelangelo, born to an ordinary family, became the man entrusted to shape the visage of Rome. Why did a pope's tomb turn into a job he considered a curse? What stood behind the painting of the Sistine Chapel? Refusal, hesitation, and 4 years of exhausting labor. And what was he like in his final years? An architect, a poet, a man who worked to his last day, never stopping his search for meaning. This is a story about how one name managed to change an entire era and still inspires the world 5 centuries later. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Bedtime stories appear here every day.
In the very heart of Tuscany, birth in turbulent times. In a small town called Caprese, nestled among hills and olive groves, a child was born in the 15th century whose name would be inscribed forever in the history of art and humankind. His name was Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni. That day, in the Podesta's house, the residence of the local judge and administrator, life went on as usual, and hardly anyone present could have foreseen that this was where the path of one of the Renaissance's greatest masters would begin. The newborn's father, Lodovico di Leonardo, belonged to an old Florentine family that had already lost its former wealth and influence. The dignity of the lineage still carried weight in the eyes of fellow citizens, yet their finances left much to be desired. In Caprese, Lodovico held the post of Podesta, an appointed administrator and judge, and was there strictly for service, together with his wife, Francesca, who came from humbler background. Francesca's health was already poor, and soon after the birth, a wet nurse was required. In infancy, Michelangelo was sent out to nurse in the village of Settignano near Florence, where the nurse lived with her husband, a man who worked marble. Some sources call him a stone cutter, others a carver. Michelangelo himself later mentioned this fact with a smile, as if with the nurse's milk he had absorbed a love for marble and chisel. Settignano was known for the craft of working stone, and it is hard to say how much the young Michelangelo consciously remembered then, yet the link between that place and his future seems symbolic to historians. When the boy was about 6, the family returned to Florence, a city already living under the sign of rebirth. Palazzi were adorned with stucco and frescoes, churches and chapels were built, new works of art appeared, and crafts and learning were truly flourishing. In this city, little Michelangelo grew up surrounded by images that to most people were simply part of the urban setting, but for him became secret lessons in future mastery. The city teemed with workshops. Painters, goldsmiths, sculptors worked in plain view of passers-by, displaying their pieces openly. Michelangelo's father, despite his pedigree, regarded art with restraint, even disdain. A man accustomed to thinking in categories of social rank and family honor, he dreamed of a notary's or official's career for his son. In those times, painters and sculptors were not considered equals to men in administrative professions, especially in families like the Buonarroti. Yet from the earliest age, the boy showed a pull towards drawing. Michelangelo sketched with charcoal right on walls and scraps of paper, copying what he saw around him. Lodovico did not encourage these pursuits. One episode is recorded in which, finding his son drawing, he angrily broke one of the sketches and even struck him. To the father, it was an idle pastime, unworthy of a noble line. Nevertheless, Michelangelo's talent proved so obvious that resisting it became impossible. One day, his older brother, Leonardo, led the father to the idea that the boy should at least be given a chance to study. Thus, at about 13, Michelangelo was apprenticed to the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of Florence's leading masters of the time. This event, important for his entire life, belongs to the next chapter. For the moment, the boy kept studying on his own, copying other masters. According to contemporaries, he often visited churches, observed frescoes, studied architectural details, and made his own sketches. Early on, he showed a special attention to the human figure, its plasticity, the way to render motion and muscular tension even in the stillness of an image. Another notable story from his youth survives in biographies: a fight with Pietro Torrigiano, also a student and painter. Torrigiano was hot-tempered and jealous. In one quarrel, he struck Michelangelo so hard that he broke his nose. The scar, indeed, stayed with the master for life, giving his face the sternness noted even in maturity. At the same time, the incident reminds us of Michelangelo's character. Despite injury and insult, he continued his work, focusing solely on art. His childhood and youth were submerged in a world of form and light. For him, no value existed above the striving to master the secret of representation, be it marble, wood, or paint. Without yet possessing a name of his own, he was already learning from the city where Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Botticelli had lived, where every building could be a textbook and any street an open-air museum. Here, among Florentine workshops, in the shadow of churches and arcades, Michelangelo began a path that would lead to immortality. For now, he was only a boy, absorbed in drawing with charcoal on walls, sometimes hiding his sketches from his father's stern gaze, and dreaming not of fame, but of one day creating something as beautiful as the statues and frescoes that surrounded him everywhere.
A Medici apprentice, first lessons in greatness. When Michelangelo turned 13, his father finally yielded to the obvious. The youth sought neither a notary's craft, nor trade, nor the civil service usually chosen for sons of status-conscious families. His drive toward art was so plain that Ludovico, against his earlier convictions, agreed to place his son in the workshop of one of Florence's most respected painters, Domenico Ghirlandaio. Ghirlandaio was renowned for the frescoes in the Tornabuoni Chapel at Santa Maria Novella, and was considered able to provide a firm, practical school for would-be painters. Order ruled the shop. Younger apprentices first stretched canvases, prepared pigments and gold, copied patterns and ornaments before they were allowed to touch serious work. Michelangelo began the same way, but it quickly became clear that his abilities exceeded the ordinary. Not only a deft hand, but a sharp eye, a desire to unravel the structure of form, to see, beyond line and shadow, the inner nature of the subject. Within months, Ghirlandaio entrusted him to delineate certain details in actual frescoes, an unusual confidence for one so young. Strict as he was, the master evidently valued the boy's seriousness and assured stroke. And it was Ghirlandaio who recommended Michelangelo for further study in the so-called Medici Garden, a place that proved decisive in the youth's fate. Arranged by Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, near the convent of San Marco, the garden housed antique statues and reliefs collected by the Medici. Young painters and sculptors were invited there to study, copy, and develop with exemplary classical art before their eyes. Ghirlandaio presented Michelangelo to Bertoldo di Giovanni, a sculptor and curator of the Medici collection, who directed the lessons in the garden. Bertoldo, a pupil of Donatello, had immense experience and, above all, the gift of passing on knowledge to students, among whom Michelangelo now stood. It was in this garden that Michelangelo first took up sculpture in earnest, working not with paint and brush, but with chisel and marble. In that garden, Michelangelo undertook his first serious statues, no longer paint and brush, but chisel and stone. One of his earliest independent works was a marble relief showing the Battle of Centaurs and Lapiths,
a Greek myth that demanded anatomy, the weaving of many figures, and a sense of tumult. The idea was suggested by the poet Angelo Poliziano, close to Lorenzo de' Medici and the circle of philosophers gathering in the Medici palace. Poliziano told stories of myth and letters, and the young Michelangelo, fired by them, tried to cast drama and motion into stone. The relief, Battle of the Centaurs, survives and is counted among the chief witnesses of his early talent. Even unpolished and unfinished, it stuns with maturity and bold composition, rare achievement for one about 15. Michelangelo became so prominent among the garden's youths that Lorenzo the Magnificent invited him to live in the palace. It was not mere patronage, but recognition. He dined and conversed daily with philosophers, poets, and artists. There he met men like Marsilio Ficino, translator of Plato, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, thinker and writer, and many others whose conversations ranged beyond art to the nature of the world, of man, and of meaning. Historians note that in these years his outlook took shape, making him not only a master of the chisel, but a philosopher in art. He kept working, studying antique statues, sketching, making small sculptures. The Medici even aided Michelangelo's family, paying his father a small allowance so the son could remain at court without service. It was rare generosity and high respect. Life at the Medici court also taught him politics, how art and power interlace. He saw statues and frescoes made not only for beauty, but to glorify the Medici, to strengthen rulers' authority, to underline Florence's wealth and grandeur. For the young master, it was a lasting lesson that later shaped his patrons and choices. The years in the Medici garden and Lorenzo's palace were brief yet decisive. After Lorenzo's death and the city's upheavals, much changed, yet the memory stayed. He later said that under Lorenzo, he first recognized himself as a true painter and sculptor, not just a pupil.
The sculptor who won renown. After Lorenzo's death, the patronage Michelangelo had known at court vanished, and the Republic entered tense years under Girolamo Savonarola, whose sermons against luxury and art steeped the city in stern air. Michelangelo kept working in Florence, but he longed for recognition beyond his home and set out for Rome, where the greatest commissions gathered. Arriving as a 21-year-old, he soon entered a circle of patrons fond of antique paste. The first was Cardinal Raphael Riario, to whom he presented a Bacchus, lightly inebriated, vine-wreathed, cup in hand, graceful and alive. The cardinal declined it as too sensual for a church court. The banker Jacopo Galli bought it and became an early patron in the capital. The statue survives in the Bargello in Florence. Through Galli came the commission that changed his life, a marble Pietà for the French king's chapel in St. Peter's. The patron was Cardinal Jean de Billiers de la Grellas, France's ambassador to the papal court. The contract was signed before Michelangelo turned 24, charging him to create a work equal to antique models. He went to Carrara to choose marble, then back in Rome worked days and nights, aiming at ideal softness in drapery and a Christ whose lifeless body still held hidden majesty. He made the Virgin youthful, an image of spiritual purity, controversial among contemporaries, but he stood by it. For him, Mary signified not a woman's age, but the soul's eternal youngness. When the Pietà was installed, it caused a sensation. Crowds came. Once he overheard visitors attributing it to another master. Outraged, he returned at night and carved his name on the sash crossing Mary's breast, the only time he signed a work. After the Pietà, his fame spread far beyond Rome. Back in Florence, he received the famed commission for David. In the cathedral works yard lay a spoiled marble block two other sculptors had failed to use, cracked, ill-shaped, left abandoned. Michelangelo inspected it and accepted the challenge. In September 1501, he began, setting up a workshop beside the Duomo. For nearly 2 years he labored, mostly alone, keeping progress hidden. He imagined not just a figure of David, but a youth before battle, charged with tension, resolve, and inner force. When finished, it stunned not only for size, over 5 meters with pedestal, but for anatomy and spirit. The Republic's council debated its placement, planned for the cathedral's buttresses. It was finally set before Palazzo Vecchio, emblem of Florence's liberty. The unveiling in spring 1504 drew great ceremony. Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and others examined it. Historians note that Michelangelo's David became the symbol not only of Florence, but of the Renaissance ideal: harmony of body, inner strength of mind, and calm confidence without showy heroics. New commissions followed. Chief among them was the famous fresco project Battle of Cascina for the Hall of the Great Council in Palazzo Vecchio. Michelangelo produced the famous cartoon, an enormous preparatory drawing of soldiers surprised as they stripped for combat, exhibiting complex poses and muscular movement. The fresco itself never began. Politics shifted, and the project remained unfinished, but the cartoon inspired a generation. By early 1505, Michelangelo's name stood with the greatest, and calls came from both Florence and Rome.
A challenge to the heavens, the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo Buonarroti, already hailed as one of the foremost sculptors of his time, came to Rome at Pope Julius II's invitation. At first the task was a grand tomb for the pontiff. Almost immediately, priorities changed. The Pope asked Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. The chapel existed since the late 15th century. Its walls bore frescoes with scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ, but the ceiling showed only a starry blue sky. Julius wanted a composition of greater weight, matching his pontificate's ambitions. For Michelangelo, the offer was unexpected and unwelcome. He saw himself as a sculptor, not a painter. Though he knew fresco, nothing in his past matched the scale ahead. Letters and notes preserve his doubts. He feared it would be a harsh trial, and even suspected rivals, architect Donato Bramante and Raphael, had prodded the Pope to undermine him. Julius, stubborn by nature, would not retreat. Michelangelo accepted, and in May 1508 began preparations. First came scaffolding. To avoid hindering services and to protect existing wall frescoes, he designed wooden platforms fixed into the walls rather than standing on the floor. These let him and assistants move along the vault, working with heads thrown back. He did hire helpers, mostly Florentines, but soon dismissed them, displeased with their quality. From then on, he executed the bulk of the frescoes himself, bringing in aid only for technical tasks, mixing colors, laying the first plaster coats. The initial plan featured apostles, but quickly he proposed a more complex, ambitious program: 9 scenes from Genesis: creation, creation of Adam, creation of Eve, the fall and the flood, alongside prophets and the genealogy of Christ. Thus the ceiling became not mere decoration, but a visual theological encyclopedia, expressed in images and moving figures. Work was heavy and painful. He often wrote to his brother and friends complaining of bodily torment. Standing on the scaffold, head bent back, he suffered constant neck and back pain. Arms went numb, eyes inflamed from dripping plaster and pigment. In one letter, he describes his posture with irony and even adds a humorous self-sketch in a contorted pose. Despite the ordeal, he persisted, pausing at times and driving the Pope to desperation. Julius demanded speed, sent envoys and letters, even came in person to inspect. One tale has the impatient Pope climbing the scaffolds. Michelangelo, unwilling to show the unfinished, brusquely told him to descend and not interfere. The Pope, surprisingly, endured it, a sign of respect for the artist's power. The labor lasted about 4 years. Sections opened gradually. The full unveiling took place on 31 October 1512.
The result stunned contemporaries, not only the grandeur of the idea, but the mastery of execution. Each figure felt alive, full of contained motion and spiritual strength. The creation of Adam, the Creator's hand reaching toward the human, became a symbol of European culture. Accounts tell of visitors standing long with heads tilted, studying every figure and detail. Tradition says Raphael, seeing the work, was so impressed he revised his own style, visible in later paintings. Michelangelo, despite universal praise, felt chiefly weariness and disappointment. He wrote that the work had been torment, not joy, and said he would rather return to sculpture, his true calling. His letters from this time echo solitude. He spent almost all hours in the chapel or his workshop, avoiding the courtly life swirling around the papal palace. With the Sistine ceiling, his name was fixed not merely as sculptor or painter, but as a universal master able to embody the greatest biblical themes in forms that do not lose force over centuries.
Between wars and popes, years of trial. Finishing the Sistine ceiling did not ease Michelangelo's path. In February 1513, Pope Julius II, the very patron who had entrusted him both the chapel and the grand tomb, died. From the beginning, the tomb's design had been immense. A central figure of the Pope surrounded by allegorical statues with dozens of other marble figures representing prophets, virtues, and symbolic forces. Over time, however, the project shrank. After Julius's death, the heirs and new popes revised the contracts, cutting the budget, reducing the scale, and moving the monument from the grand nave of St. Peter's to the smaller church of San Pietro in Vincoli. Michelangelo returned to it repeatedly, signing new agreements, yet always facing delays, new demands, or financial disputes. In letters from this period, he wrote bitterly that the tomb had become the tragedy of my life, not for the carving itself, but for the endless lawsuits, revisions, and obstacles. From this long ordeal emerged the statue of Moses, today in San Pietro in Vincoli, one of his most powerful works. A seated, coiled figure of strength, with tense hands, flowing beard, and eyes alive with suppressed motion. Legend says the artist struck it on the knee with his hammer and cried, "Why don't you speak?" At the same time, he was constantly torn between Rome and Florence. Pope Leo X, a Medici, commissioned him to design a facade for San Lorenzo, the family church in Florence. It was a high honor, but the project faltered. Marble selection, transport, scaffolding, and constant disputes between the papal treasury and the Florentine government stalled it. Years of models and drawings ended in an unfinished facade. The church remains bare to this day. Italy around him seethed. In 1527, the sack of Rome by imperial troops shocked the world. Soon after, Florence fell under siege as the Republic returned and then collapsed. Michelangelo, loyal to the Republic, became chief of fortifications. The same man who had painted Adam now designed bastions, ramparts, and fortified gates. Surviving plans and letters show his precise technical sense. He advised commanders, inspected walls, and personally supervised works. When the city surrendered and the Medici regained power, he went into hiding, fearing vengeance. For weeks, he concealed himself in a small, secret chamber beneath the new sacristy of San Lorenzo, a tiny room discovered only in the 20th century. On its plastered walls remain charcoal sketches of faces and figures attributed to him. Friends, and finally Pope Clement VII, another Medici, secured his pardon. But the experience left deep marks. He became more withdrawn, avoiding society, devoting himself entirely to work. During these years, he created the sculptures for the Medici Chapel, the allegories dawn, dusk, night, and day. Works that express time and motion not in serene classical calm, but in restless, twisting forms. The anxiety of age, of mortality, of thought. These figures reflect the state of the artist himself, a man who had survived wars, betrayals, and shifting powers, yet still carved with faith in form's strength. At the same time, he turned more often to poetry. He wrote sonnets and letters, meditating on art, faith, time, and death. His verse reads like a private diary, the confession of a man less concerned with glory than with understanding the soul.
Architect of the Eternal City. By the mid-1540s, when Michelangelo was past 70, he was already revered as the greatest sculptor and painter of his age, but a new role awaited him, that of Rome's chief architect, the man whose vision would define the city's face for centuries. After Antonio da Sangallo the Younger's death, Pope Paul III Farnese appointed Michelangelo head architect of St. Peter's Basilica, a project begun by Bramante decades earlier and altered by many hands. The building stood incomplete. The foundations and walls existed, but the plan had become confused. Michelangelo immediately simplified it. He stripped away unnecessary additions, strengthened the drum, thickened the walls, and restored clarity and grandeur. Surviving drawings show his steady pursuit of harmony, weight, and lucidity. He personally tested the marble, climbed scaffolds, and argued with builders, drawing lines directly on stone. His chief concern was the dome, which he envisioned as a double shell, a monumental crown for the Apostle Peter and a sign of the Church's unity. "The Church will rise like a mountain of light," he wrote. In his lifetime, only the drum was finished, but his successor, Giacomo della Porta, followed his plan so faithfully that the dome we see today is essentially Michelangelo's. At the same time, he was commissioned to redesign the Capitoline Hill, the ancient civic heart of Rome, long neglected. Paul III wanted an ensemble that joined classical dignity with Renaissance order. Michelangelo recast the facades of the Palazzo dei Conservatori, the Palazzo Nuovo, and the Palazzo Senatorio, placed the bronze equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius at the center, and designed the famous Cordonata staircase, broad and gentle, climbable by riders as well as pedestrians. He even drew the oval star-shaped paving pattern, realized after his death. Architectural historians see in these works the hallmark of his late style: severe, massive, dominated by verticals and deep niches, sparse in ornament but immense in presence. He called needless decoration babbling in stone, and sought pure form that expressed dignity and strength. Though burdened with age, he visited the sites daily, speaking with masons, marking corrections himself. His house became an architect's den, drawings, models, calculations everywhere. He rarely attended gatherings or festivities. He took no new painting or sculpture commissions. His world was marble, scaffolds, and plans. In that quiet labor, he forged the Rome whose silhouette still bears his hand.
Last years, poetry, faith, and solitude. In the final years of his long life, Michelangelo, sculptor, painter, architect, turned more and more to words. His late diaries were written not with chisel, but with pen. Letters, sonnets, short reflections reveal the side long hidden behind the stern public master. Living in Rome from the 1530s until his death, he led a secluded life. His rooms were filled not only with architectural plans and models of St. Peter's, but also with piles of paper, drafts of letters, thoughts, and hundreds of poems written for himself and a few friends. He had written verse since youth, but after 70 he did so more intensely when his body weakened and his mind turned toward questions of eternity. A constant theme of his late poetry was repentance and the vanity of art, that even the finest statue or most perfect church is nothing before divine judgment. Neither color nor chisel will save me from death. All I have made returns to dust, he wrote. A central bond of this period was his friendship with Vittoria Colonna, noble poet and widow of the Marquis of Pescara. Their correspondence and meetings lasted nearly a decade until her death in 1547. They spoke of faith, love, and redemption. Dozens of letters survive in which he shares verses, asks counsel, and confides his thoughts. Tradition says he left in her house a small drawing of the crucified Christ, restrained, tender, deeply spiritual, one of the few works made not for patron or church, but for a beloved soul. After her death, he grew more isolated, yet continued his duties. As chief architect of St. Peter's, he worked until nearly the end. In sculpture, he sought new expression in the Rondinini Pietà, created almost blind, carving until his last months. Unlike his early perfection, this work is rough, elongated, unfinished, a vision of spirit struggling free from matter, as if he wished to release the stone from flesh into thought. He was surrounded by faithful assistants, Daniele de Volterra, Tiberio Calcani, Francesco Amanati, who helped him with work and daily care, handling letters, food, and commissions. Michelangelo died in Rome on 18th February 1564. In his will, his body was secretly taken to Florence and buried in Santa Croce. On his tomb, designed by Vasari, 3 allegorical figures, painting, sculpture, and architecture, mourn him, as if confessing that all 3 arts were one life bound in a single man.
The legacy of Michelangelo, a name that will not fade. After Michelangelo's death, his name did not vanish into the past. It began a new life. First in the memories of contemporaries, then in books, letters, and in the works of those who came after him. And finally, in the very look of European cities, where the trace of his hand remains in stone, paint, line, and dome. Almost at once, he was seen not simply as part of heritage, but as the very symbol of genius itself. His admirer and biographer, Giorgio Vasari, who personally knew him, placed Michelangelo at the summit of his lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, the culmination of Italian art, the peak toward which generations had climbed. Vasari wrote that with Michelangelo, the age of the Renaissance reached completion. So vast and immeasurable was his contribution. Already in the early 16th century, masters across Europe began to imitate him, though few dared call themselves his heirs. His name was spoken with reverence, almost religious. In workshops across Italy and France, students copied his figures, studied his anatomical sketches, and made plaster casts of his statues. The David, Moses, and fragments of the Sistine frescoes became required study for young artists. By the 18th century, however, new voices arose. The Age of Enlightenment, devoted to reason and moderation, viewed Michelangelo's power with caution. Critics called his figures too strained, his architecture too heavy, his late works obscure. Yet even the most restrained admitted that art could not be discussed without him.
He was a constant presence. One could debate him, but never ignore him. The 19th century brought his return in glory. The Romantics, and later the Symbolists, found in his work something deeper than form, an intensity of spirit, a drama of the soul. In Germany, writers and philosophers like Goethe and Schelling spoke of him as a titan. In France, sculptors such as Auguste Rodin called themselves his disciples. Rodin once said, "If mankind were to keep only one statue, let it be Michelangelo's Moses, for in it lives all: anger, reason, strength, and faith." The 20th century, though it overthrew classical canons, did not reject him. It rediscovered him. Modern architects studied his proportions as feats of engineering and vision. Painters like Picasso and Matisse sought in his forms a new visual language. Even abstraction carried echoes of his sculptural tension and compressed energy. Art historians published ever more studies on his drawings, symbols, and hidden meanings, while his life and loves remained subjects of debate and fascination. His late sculptures, especially the Rondanini Pietà, drew special attention. In its rough, unpolished outlines, many saw a prophecy of modern art, what later critics would call existential sculpture. It now stands beside the works of Giacometti and Brancusi as a link between centuries. Beyond academia, Michelangelo entered popular culture, films, novels, theater, even comics, without losing depth. In Italy, his name became not only a chapter in museums, but part of the nation's identity. Visitors to Florence, Rome, or Milan seek not merely atmosphere, but a meeting with the man who, centuries ago, took a chisel to free from marble figures that never age. Thus, Michelangelo's legacy is more than preserved. It has become part of our inner perception of beauty and form. His figures teach us to feel tension, striving, the unreachable ideal. His words, filled with doubt, remind us that behind outward might lies inner struggle. His name endures not because textbooks demand it, but because it continues to speak in architectural lines, in sculptural gestures, in the hush of chapels, and in that bright astonishment we feel when we look into a face he carved from stone and suddenly recognize something of ourselves.